Welcome back to Historical Context. Today we continue our series on the English Civil War and its impact on colonial America. Where we last left off, a conflict had started in England between those forces loyal to the crown, they were also called royalists, and forces loyal to the Parliament. They were also referred to as Roundheads. In early 1642, Sir William Berkeley arrives finally as the new governor of Virginia. He was appointed by King Charles I. He was closely aligned with the king. They were very close. And now the king is fighting for his kingdom outside of London. So we can expect Virginia to probably be more aligned with the royalist cause going forward. Mainly also because the colonists in Virginia shared similar sentiments as Berkeley. An example of this came in late 1641 as the movement to abandon the royal colony and go back to company rule flared up once again in Virginia. This is how Virginia started as a company. The company was eventually disbanded, but conversation has continued to flare up every now and then for the last 15 years about whether or not to go back to company rule. And it did again. And the Virginia Assembly was convened to take up the matter. And they found that, let's have a look at the writing. Having fully debated and maturely considered the reasons on both sides, as well arguing for as against a company, and looking back into the condition of the times under the company, as also upon the present state of the colony, under His Majesty's government, they find the late company in their government intolerable, the present comparatively happy, and that the old corporation cannot, with any profitability, be introduced without absolute ruin and dissolution to the colony. There will be no company in Virginia. They stay a royal colony. The horrible treatment of subjects during the previous company's rule and the present happiness of the colony were cited as reasons to just leave things as they were. King Charles would respond to the assembly by affirming their wishes, but not mentioning any of the domestic distress occurring in England. So for his response, it seemed business as usual. In January, this is 1642, King Charles tried to arrest 6 members of Parliament, but they escaped. Charles I raises a royal army and the royal battle standard over Nottingham, which was effectively a declaration of war against his own Parliament. Meanwhile, at Massachusetts Bay, the fear of a lifetime tenure over John Winthrop was clearly abated. We talked about this last week. People were concerned John Winthrop was going to be a lifetime governor, so they elected somebody else. But in 1642, they went back to John Winthrop. It was his 3rd tenure as governor. Thomas Dudley was named assistant, but refused the commission. He was later talked into changing his mind. The colony built 5 ships that year, so the pivot into shipbuilding is on. And if you've seen prior programs about American history, I think America, the Story of Us, is probably the most prominent that comes to mind. In the early first episode, they talk about shipbuilding being a huge thing in the colony. It actually wasn't at the very beginning. The economic depression of 1640 flipped what the colony should be doing away from agricultural and into some type of manufacturing. For the Massachusetts Bay Colony, it was shipbuilding. During this time, the colony annexed much of what we now know as New Hampshire. I'm sure that John Wheelwright, who founded Exeter, New Hampshire, was thrilled to see the colony that he was banished from take control just a few years later. Surprisingly, despite the change of control, New Hampshire towns were given a great deal of autonomy from Massachusetts Bay. In late 1642, a flurry of letters descended on the colonies of New England from Parliament requesting their help establishing a church in England. So the days of Puritans meeting in secret from fear of arrest were over. Now the parliamentarians in England wanted their own church. Thomas Hooker felt, according to Winthrop, that the work did not warrant the 3,000-mile trip. So Thomas Hooker wasn't going to get involved. He was one of the people asked. As others considered returning, a new flurry of letters came in the weeks later, advising everyone to stay put, as a war had broken out. So now the Puritans in England are telling people, stay where you are. Stay where you are. There is a war occurring. The next flurry of correspondence came from Connecticut, where word was coming in that native tribes were aligning against all English colonies. Connecticut asked the Puritans to bring 100 men to the Connecticut River, and they would meet with an equal group there, making it a 200-man army. The colony decided to disarm and interrogate the local natives first, where they found no conspiracy. Ultimately, after some discussion between parties, Massachusetts Bay decided not to engage in a war against the natives. The colony went so far as to return the weapons to the natives that they had originally disarmed. Despite the colony's comfort, they took this opportunity to institute military watches and ensure each town have ammunition. Note, the colony continued to provide in its own defense, so it is doing this all on its own. The continued depression in prices and the lack of trade and shipments due to either the war or economic impact started to create a group of people leaving for England. But in spite of all of this, a unique event occurred. Let's have a look. 9 bachelors commenced at Cambridge. They were young men of good hope and performed their acts so as gave good proof of their proficiency in the tongues and arts. The general court had settled a government or superintendency over the college. All the magistrates and elders over the 6 nearest churches and the president or the greatest part of these. What John Winthrop is referring to there is the first graduating class of Harvard College. Over the winter, the only news of events in England came by fishing boats who had been in England and had come to the colony. A shortage of corn affected the region that winter, and the price of corn quadrupled to 12 shillings per bushel. As the year 1643 started, the alliance amongst the natives became a mounting threat against New England. In response, the colonies of Massachusetts Bay, Plymouth, Connecticut, and New Haven came together and formed the United Colonies of New England. So technically the 13 colonies/states were not the first confederation in the New World. In fact, Articles of Confederation were drafted and published in both John Winthrop's History of New England and William Bradford's of Plymouth Plantation. The first article stated that they be called the United Colonies of New England. The second article defined them as united in friendship and mutual safety. The third article locked in the boundaries of each respective colony, and that's been a bit of an issue up to this point. The fourth article laid out the mutual calculation of military aid being based on the number of men aged 16 to 60 from each colony. Each colony was assigned 2 commissioners who would be responsible for reporting the census data. The fifth article dictated the defense of any colony that is invaded by an enemy. Sounds like the Monroe Doctrine, only it's a couple hundred years earlier. The next few articles discussed how the commissioners were composed and that the United Colonies could develop independent agreements with one another. One of the first meetings between the commissioners actually dealt with a war that broke out between 2 native tribes. The Uncas had captured their rival tribe's leader and wanted him put to death, but consulted with the United Colonies first. The commissioners advised that an execution would promote the safety of the Uncas, but it must be carried out in a respectful manner. The Uncas would follow the commissioners' advice. As 1643 draws to a close, New England Puritans seem to be aligning against the native threats and uniting together, while the Civil War itself begins to tilt towards their allies at home. While the war seems to be 3,000 miles away, it's about to come to the colonies. And we'll talk about that next time on Historical Context.